Joining me now is Buffalo News sports writer Tim Graham, who interviewed O.J. Simpson earlier this week. It's the question every journalist has to have for you. How did you get that interview? People all over the country, all over the world have been trying to get him to sit down.
It's a matter of finding the right gatekeeper. And he has a guy, and nobody else knows who this guy is. And I found out who the guy is. So
that put the wheels in motion. Okay, so obviously you're not going to reveal that source to me. But apparently you referenced in the article that he still has quite an affinity for Buffalo. So that was your in.
Well, that played a part for sure. And you know, what cards do you have to play if you're a Buffalo reporter? Don't even have to be a sports reporter. What cards do you have to play to get an interview like this? And it's the fact that this is where you played. And it takes him back in his mind to a happier time when things were carefree and he was the O.J. Simpson that everybody loved before the notoriety. And I think that appealed to him. And once I approached with the pitch of we can talk about football, he went for it. And I suspected that once we got going, and because he is known as such a gregarious person, that it wasn't going to be just about football, number one. But the other part too is that there are so many things about football that allow you to ask about the real world, such as CTE and concussions, which is something that a lot of people have wondered about O.J. Simpson for a long time, such as Donald Trump technically tried to buy the Bills, that's a football question, such as Colin Kaepernick kneeling for the national anthem. There are all kinds of things that you can talk about through football's prism. And my guess was that once I was able to sit down with O.J. Simpson, that we would go all over the place.
Absolutely. So you did, though, to make it clear, you did have that condition going in. He wanted only to talk about football. That's what he said, and you agreed to that. I
offered. That was my initial offer, was we'll talk about football. And, you know, it's the same as if you're going to, I guess if you're dating, it's like, hey, let's just get a coffee, right? You know, so let's just make a connection and see what happens. And I was prepared for him to talk about only football. And I suspect that I'm getting some criticism now nationally about not asking certain questions, but I was prepared for even a stricter football interview. And my thinking being is that, look, he's a complicated person. He's lived a life that everybody has dissected. This adds another layer to the onion of who O.J. Simpson is as a person. Playing football was a big part of his life, especially here in Buffalo. And if we can learn something about that, at least another layer to the person. And if somebody was going to be upset with that and say that shouldn't be a condition of the interview, everything should be on the table, then I would say, okay, then cast my interview, my story aside, don't read it, and wait for the next person to interview him, and they'll ask him those questions. And I'm not offended by that. So, but it did turn out to be more than football anyway. So we don't have to worry about that scenario.
Right. Well, let me ask you about your impression of him. We've been reading your work for a lot of years in the Buffalo News. You've interviewed all types, all ages, all walks of life. How did you find him? Was he what you expected him to be?
I didn't know what to expect, and I'm pretty good at compartmentalizing when it comes to work, probably in life in general. I'm kind of focused. I'd be a good athlete because I only know about the next game, you know, one day at a time, right? Just focusing on this day, not thinking too far ahead. And I thought, you know what, when I get to the point where I'm ringing the doorbell, maybe I'll get nervous. But I prepped, I was ready to go, and when we went into the house, and there he was, and you think larger than life, I felt nothing extra. And it's because, and it's what you hear all the time, it's the consensus, he is so disarmingly charming. He's a nice guy, and he was just he was O.J. Simpson that we knew when he was playing for the Buffalo Bills and on the Hertz commercials and Nordberg in the Naked Gun movie. He was just O.J., and all the other stuff kind of fell to the side.
Well, let me ask you, did you push the boundaries at all of what you agreed to talk about? Did it get contentious? Did you get to see, I don't know, did you ruffle his feathers at all?
No, it never got contentious. There were some questions that I thought he would bristle at, and he didn't. And, well, for instance, let's start with the very first question. I asked him, why are you doing this interview? And I timed it. 38 seconds into that question, he started talking about being in prison. Now, I had no questions on my list about being in prison other than the fact that a lot of prominent people died when he was in prison, and I wanted to ask for his thoughts, for instance, on Ralph Wilson,
Right.
Muhammad Ali, people he was close to. He talked to me about his relationship with Michael Jackson, Lou Saban, the Bills coach. But 38 seconds into a vague question, he chose to tell me about prison. And so at that point, I immediately knew that he's going to take me all kinds of places that I don't really need to steer him. But once he did bring in those things, I would ask follow-up questions for sure.
Sure.
He mentioned to me about, he started mentioning all the different prison gangs that were there and how it was tough when, for instance, Muhammad Ali or Michael Jackson died, to hear about the white supremacists there who were taking glee in the death of people who he considered close friends, and how he had to keep it to himself. He couldn't defend his friends because it was too dangerous. So I asked him the follow-up question, did you have to affiliate with a gang? Now that's not a football question, but he brought it up, and I had to ask that follow-up. That said, I did keep my questions to whatever was on my list, which I didn't show him ahead of time, or whatever he brought up first. And from what I understand, we talked about, everything's mentioned in the story. I mentioned the trial. I mentioned Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson's deaths, that he was acquitted, the Bronco chase, that he's in prison for the sports memorabilia heist, which was Keystone Cops type stuff. It's all in the story, but I've heard back from him that he thought it was fair. He thought he was okay with your, as long as I treated him fairly, that I approached him in a professional manner, and even though all that stuff is in the story, and I'll take a step back. The one question I thought he was going to have a problem with was about CTE. That if, as a savvy guy that he is, a media savvy guy, I thought that he would immediately take a question about brain injuries and concussions and say, this is a way for this guy to ask me about the murders. But as soon as I asked him about CTE and concussions, he was transparent. He told me about the concussions he had, his concerns that he might have CTE, that his friend Al Cowlings is showing signs of CTE, friends and family, that it is an issue in the NFL and with a heavy workload that he had as a player.
Right.
I thought for sure, that was my suspicion, is that when I asked that question, he would disconnect. Right. And he didn't. I think he was in a position like he was back in his playing days, probably going back to when he's at his locker stall at USC. He was just sitting down with a guy, shooting the breeze about sports. And he went everywhere. And I think that if there's a follow-up interview, that we probably do push those boundaries. And he would be willing to do it because now there's a trust and a connection there. Maybe you're a little disarmingly charming and it worked on OJ, maybe in reverse. He did a lot more talking than I did. Yeah, that's for sure. Well, here's just another quick little tidbit about the interview. I went there thinking it was going to be 2 hours, which I thought was going to be more than enough. Yeah, so how much time did you end up spending? 3 hours. Wow. And I got there and immediately it was, we might only have 1 hour because I have a tea time, but he got his schedule mixed up and we ended up sitting for 3 hours. Very interesting. I want to ask really quickly about Ralph Wilson, and the Wall of Fame specifically, because so many fans are still conflicted about seeing his name up on the wall. Right. Did that come up at all? Did you bring it up? Did he mention anything about his relationship with Buffalo or the city? Oh, sure. Not the Wall of Fame in particular. I think that's been talked about. I don't think he's coming off the Wall of Fame. Nothing from the Fox special from Sunday night was anything we didn't already know. It was just in a different format. It was done in video. You could actually see him saying those things that he actually was in that ghost-written book 12 years ago. He's in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. His bust will stay there. His jersey will remain retired by USC. His jersey's not retired by the Bills, but it's out of circulation. But he has an affinity for Buffalo. The fact that I worked for a Buffalo outlet made a big difference. He felt like he was connecting with people who remembered him as the Juice. Right. And got to talk about the electric company and Lou Saban, and he was transparent about Ralph Wilson, and he was not particularly fond of Ralph Wilson as an owner, although he considered him a friend later in life. He did not think Ralph was about winning, that he was about making money, and he would pay somebody like O.J. Simpson to fill the stadium. But that was it. That was it. If you win a championship, then everybody gets a raise. If you fill the stadium, then only O.J. Simpson gets the raise. And that was Ralph's sweet spot, filling the stadium without too much success, and that's the way you can make the most money. Now that evolved.
Yeah, I was going to say, we know
The
that
Super
later
Bowl
on-
era, as OJ said, he suspects that it's because Ralph got older and wealthier. And he got comfortable enough where money wasn't as important, and he got up in age and thought, now it's time to win championships. But by then, OJ was long retired.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating read. We want to let everybody know it's available online right now, and then in Sunday's Buffalo News,
Yes.
the full story will be printed, and there may be more to come, it sounds like.
There are actually more stories. There's the main feature, and then I'll have probably by the time, well, already online, but over the weekend, maybe 4 or 5 additional stories, because it was a 3-hour interview. There were a lot of leftovers.
I was going to say, sounds like there's still a lot of meat on that bone. Alrighty, well, we appreciate your time. Tim Graham,
Thank you.
Buffalo News, thanks for staying with us.